Which I would suggest is something of a reneging on the deal to keep this trip private.
She immediately understands that the King and Queen have hosted the Duke and Duchess of Sussex with Prince Archie.
With Harry and Meghan. Was it an interview? It wasn't very good journalism, that's for damn sure.
That photo, let's sit on that for a second, Tim, because this photo is what has got a lot of people upset. Because
who is his age, with whom he is in love.
Sharing sweet new moments with husband Prince Harry and their two kids, Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet.
She did with Harry and Meghan soon after Megxit, that now notorious video.
Increasing and significant shift in sentiment, a feeling that the American dream might not be all that it was cracked up to be.
Yes, well, they don't believe what they've said, do they? They don't care. They've said it, but that was then.
And grandson from Prince Harry's side of the family since the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee all the way back in June 20.
Attempting to, how do you put it, reverse Megxit. The American dream they promoted has cooled dramatically.
18 months ago, I spoke to a communications professional on Team Sussex who said to me, Harry's,
or as I like to call it, the days of our Montecito lives, because Harry and Meghan, they just don't quit. He, Meghan, and the children had the secret meeting with King Charles and Queen Camilla at Highgrove. All would have been so planned out and lovely, but also there was all the hijinks that went on before. This feel like an outcast. And so is Meghan in the United States.
Truly does rally for mental health, and it weakened their authority in a space where they are truly doing great work.
I think it's quite significant. Harry and Queen Camilla have not exactly been on the best of terms ever since the publication of Harry's memoir.
November 2020. A wreath sat in a box at the Royal British Legion's headquarters in Kent. It never left that room. It was never carried to the Cenotaph, and the man who ordered it made sure of that in under 2 seconds. That man wasn't a palace aide. It wasn't a communications officer smoothing over a scheduling conflict. According to royal historian Robert Lacey, citing veteran correspondent Rebecca English, the decision came from Queen Elizabeth herself, not delegated, not filtered through committee. Her voice, her answer, delivered almost instantly. If you want more deep dives like this, make sure to subscribe to Royal Archives. For months, the public understood this story differently. When Prince Harry was first denied the chance to have a wreath laid on his behalf at the Cenotaph, early reporting suggested palace officials had made the call without her knowledge. Bureaucrats following protocol, keeping the Queen out of an uncomfortable decision. That version circulated for weeks. It was tidy. It protected her from criticism. And according to Lacey's later research, it wasn't accurate. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what Remembrance Sunday meant to Elizabeth II. For over 60 years, she stood at the Cenotaph in November, dressed in black, laying a wreath of poppies for the men and women who never came home. It was one of the few dates in her calendar that never moved, never softened, never became ceremonial in the empty sense of the word. A palace source later described it plainly. Nothing happened there without her direct knowledge. Sacrosanct was the word used, not tradition, not custom. Sacrosanct. By November 2020, the world had changed around her. Harry and Meghan had stepped back from royal duties in January of that year. They'd relocated to California. Harry had been stripped of his honorary military titles, Captain General of the Royal Marines among them, a role his father had held decades before him. The military connection that once tied Harry to the institution, the one built through 10 years of service and 2 tours in Afghanistan, had been formally severed on paper, even if the medals and memories remained his own. So when Harry asked whether a wreath could be laid in his name, he wasn't asking for a favor. He was asking whether the door back to that one ceremony, the one built entirely on service and sacrifice, could stay open a crack. The answer came back closed. According to Lacey's account, the Queen didn't deliberate. She didn't request more information or ask her private secretary for options. The refusal was immediate. Described in his book as taking her, in his words, all of 2 seconds. For a monarch known for careful, calculated public silence, That speed says something the silence usually hides. Why would she move that fast? This is where the story deepens and where public reactions split hard down the middle. Across social media, one question kept surfacing. Was this really about protocol, or was it about control? Was the Queen protecting an institution, or was she drawing a line meant to be felt? Neither Lacey nor English claimed to know her private reasoning with certainty. No one but the Queen herself could say for sure what passed through her mind in those 2 seconds. But the pattern around it tells its own story. Frontline royals lay wreaths at the cenotaph. That's the rule, and it had never bent before. Not for illness, not for age, not for absence. When Elizabeth herself became too frail to attend in 2021, she didn't ask for an exception to be made in her honor. She asked Prince Charles to lay the wreath on her behalf, keeping the tradition inside the family line that still held official standing. The rule mattered more than the person standing in for her. Harry, by January 2020, no longer occupied that line. He'd chosen distance, and whether that choice was necessary for his family's well-being, or a rupture the institution never fully accepted, the cenotaph doesn't measure intention, it measures status. Harry's request tested whether emotional history could override institutional structure. It couldn't. Not that year. What makes this moment different from other Sussex-related headlines is the absence of anger in how it's described. There's no reported outburst, no dramatic confrontation. Just a fast final no from a 94-year-old monarch who had buried a husband of 73 years the previous spring and was, by multiple accounts, exhausted by the year's losses long before November arrived. Some observers have pointed to that exhaustion as part of the explanation. A woman with limited emotional bandwidth left, unwilling to renegotiate a boundary that had defined her entire public identity. Others read it differently. That's when attention quietly shifted toward the deeper rift building since Megxit, the sense, among some royal watchers, that every small decision that year carried weight far beyond its surface. A wreath isn't just a wreath when the family behind it is being watched for every signal of reconciliation or rejection. Denied the chance to take part from London, Harry didn't stay silent. He and Meghan traveled to the Los Angeles National Cemetery that same Remembrance Sunday. There, away from cameras that would have followed a cenotaph appearance, they laid their own wreath and placed flowers at the graves of 2 Commonwealth soldiers. The wreath carried an inscription: "In memory of the men who offered their lives in defense of their country." Harry added a personal note beneath it: "To all those who have served and are serving, thank you." No press pool, no official palace photographer, just 2 people and 2 graves belonging to men neither of them had known personally, but whose service Harry understood in a way few outside the military ever fully grasp. A source close to the couple told reporters afterward that it mattered to them to mark the day in their own way, on their own terms, honoring service without needing institutional permission to do it. That framing matters. It reads less like defiance and more like a man finding a private way to keep something the public ceremony had just taken from him. Back in London, the boxed wreath stayed at the Legion's Kent headquarters, unclaimed and unused. Nobody photographed it. Nobody made a public statement about its fate. It simply sat there. A small physical symbol of a request that had been prepared for, hoped for, and ultimately shelved within seconds of reaching the one person who could approve it. This is where the story's second layer emerges, the one Lacey's book brought into focus years after the fact. When journalists first reported the denial in November 2020, the framing protected the Queen. Palace officials, unnamed and faceless, took the blame. It was easier to imagine an overcautious courtier drawing a hard line than to imagine a grandmother saying no to a grandson who'd served his country for a decade. That earlier version let readers keep a certain image of Elizabeth intact, a woman above the family's private conflicts, insulated from the harder decisions. Lacey's reporting, built on English's sourcing, dismantled that image. It wasn't the courtiers, it was her. And once that detail became public, years later, it reframed everything about how insiders understood her relationship to protocol during that period. She wasn't a passive figurehead letting aides manage an awkward family situation. She was actively drawing boundaries, deciding in real time what her family's departure from royal life meant for their access to the institution's most sacred rituals. Those who worked closest to her during this era have described a monarch who compartmentalized grief and duty with remarkable discipline, able to mourn privately while maintaining public function without visible cracks. The 2-second refusal fits that pattern. It wasn't cruelty. According to those who understood her approach to the role, it was consistency, applied without exception, even when the exception involved someone she'd known since birth. The long-term consequences rippled outward in ways that outlasted the news cycle. For Harry, the moment reportedly deepened a sense that reconciliation with the institution came with conditions he hadn't fully accepted when he and Meghan made their choice to step back. Being a father, a husband, a private citizen, none of that translated into automatic re-entry, even for a single ceremonial day built entirely around the kind of service he'd genuinely given. For the family more broadly, it became one more data point in the slow, well-documented drift between Harry and the institution his grandmother led until her final months. For the Queen, biographers have suggested the moment reflected something she rarely said aloud, that love for a family member and duty to an institution could pull in opposite directions, and that when they did, duty won. It's a harder image than the doting grandmother portrait, so often used to describe her private relationships. But it's the one that holds up against what actually happened that November. There's also a quieter historical echo, worth noting. Years earlier, during a different family rupture, Elizabeth had drawn similarly firm lines around who could and couldn't participate in official royal ceremonies, tying access directly to active duty rather than bloodline alone. The Cenotaph decision in 2020 wasn't an isolated hardline moment. It was consistent with decades of the same underlying principle. The institution's rituals belonged to those actively serving it, not to those who'd stepped away, however painful that distinction became in practice. There's a wider context to that November that rarely makes it into the headlines about the wreath itself. This was 2020. The ceremony at the Cenotaph that year was already scaled back because of the pandemic, closed to the public for the first time in its modern history, attended by a smaller number of veterans and dignitaries than any year in living memory. The Queen herself watched from a balcony rather than standing at ground level, a concession to her age and to the health restrictions gripping the country. Even in a year when the ceremony itself had already been stripped down to its essentials, the rule about who could participate stayed untouched. If anything, a smaller, more restricted cenotaph made the boundary sharper, not softer. Fewer wreaths were laid that year, the ones that were carried even more weight than usual. Behind the scenes, the Queen was navigating more than just Harry's request. Prince Philip's health had been declining steadily through 2020, and those close to the family have described a household under quiet strain. A monarch managing her husband's frailty, a pandemic reshaping every public duty, and a grandson's departure from royal life, still raw less than a year after the Sandringham Summit had formalized the split. Aides who worked within the household that year later described her as someone who compartmentalized these pressures rather than letting them bleed into her decision-making. The Cenotaph refusal, in that light, wasn't an emotional reaction to a difficult year. It was, if anything, evidence of how little that difficult year was allowed to bend her judgment on matters of protocol. Other royals were watching too, even if none spoke publicly about the Wreath decision at the time. Prince William, according to reporting from that period, had grown increasingly protective of the institution's boundaries following his brother's departure, cautious about any gesture that might be read as blurring the line between working royals and those who'd stepped back. Whether or not William had any direct influence on the Queen's decision, courtiers close to the household have suggested his broader posture. That year reflected the same underlying principle she applied to the wreath. Distance from active duty meant distance from its rituals, regardless of family history or personal service record. The Cenotaph moment also arrived against a longer institutional memory the Queen carried personally. Decades earlier, she'd overseen similar boundary drawing around ceremonial participation for royals who'd married out, stepped back, or lost official standing, always with the same underlying logic. Access followed function, not affection. Royal historians studying her 7 decades on the throne have pointed to this as one of the most consistent threads in how she managed the institution. Warmth in private, discipline in public, and almost no exceptions when the two came into conflict. The Wreath decision, viewed against that pattern, wasn't an aberration. It was the rule working exactly as she'd always applied it. By the time Robert Lacey's book brought Rebecca English's sourcing into wider circulation, Elizabeth had already passed. The reporting arrived as one more piece in the ongoing effort to understand who she truly was behind 6 decades of careful public composure. Not the softened version often presented in tribute specials, but a woman capable of fast, unsentimental decisions when the institution's boundaries were tested. What's left unresolved is whether Harry himself has ever spoken privately about that specific refusal, separate from the broader narrative of Megxit and its aftermath. Public statements from him have touched on service and gratitude toward veterans repeatedly since 2020, but he's never directly addressed the wreath, the 2-second answer, or what it felt like watching that door close while thousands of miles away in California, marking the day on his own terms instead. Staff who worked at Buckingham Palace during that period have offered small, indirect glimpses into how the household absorbed moments like this. According to those present in the building that autumn, the Queen rarely discussed Sussex-related decisions at length once they were made. She gave her answer, and the household moved forward without revisiting it. That brevity has been read 2 ways by people who knew her. Some describe it as emotional discipline, a woman who'd spent 7 decades learning not to dwell publicly on private pain. Others describe it as genuine certainty, a sense that, for her, the decision simply wasn't complicated, however painful it may have looked from the outside looking in. What her private letters and unscripted remarks from that year do reveal, according to biographers who've had access to portions of her correspondence, is a woman acutely aware of how much the family's rupture was costing everyone involved, not just Harry, not just herself, but the wider institution she'd spent her life protecting. She rarely used the word regret in public, but those closest to her have suggested the Wreath decision sat differently with her than routine protocol matters usually did, even if her outward response gave no sign of hesitation. The boxed wreath in Kent, the instant refusal, the quiet tribute at a cemetery on the other side of the world. 3 images from the same November day, each carrying a different weight depending on which side of the story you're standing on. What they add up to is a portrait of an institution and a grandmother willing to hold its lines even when holding them costs something personal, whether that boundary softens for future generations of the family or whether it remains as fixed as it was that November morning is a question only time and the next generation of royals watching from the sidelines will eventually answer.